So everyone, welcome. Thank you for being here today. We're joined by people from all over the place, from Hunter College, all over the world. Um, my name is Alex Rogals. I am a professor of Japanese culture here at Hunter College, and we are very, very lucky today because we're going to be talking with three very accomplished people in the world of Japanese ghosts, monsters, folklore. Um, we are still waiting for one more panelist. He's stuck in traffic, but he'll be here. While we are waiting, we can just get into it and we'll say hello to him when he gets here. Um, in terms of returning to that first thing I mentioned about questions, I'd like to point out that the little Q&A button down there, you may feel free to ask questions at any time. We are going to have an open discussion at the beginning and towards the end of this event. Then we'll move on to questions and answers. Some of you have already submitted questions along when you registered, so I have those. But please feel free to ask as you hear things and things pop up in your mind. All right. So without further ado, oh, and there's a question about whether the recording will be shared. It will. Once everything is put together and approved, it will be posted on the Hunter College Japanese program YouTube page, which I'll let people know about who might want to see this later. So without further ado, I am going to start by introducing two of our three guests. So in alphabetical order by last name, first is Rebecca Copeland. She's a professor of Japanese language and literature at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research and teaching is informed by questions of both gender and genre. She focuses almost exclusively on modern Japanese women writers, examining the way their gender has defined and often confined their literary production. Her book, which we'll be talking a bit about today, Yamamba, is a story about mountain witches and combines both scholarship with original fiction. Dr. Copeland, on that note, is also a very accomplished author of fiction. Her book, The Kimono Tattoo, which was her debut work, takes the readers on a journey into Kyoto's intricate world of kimono design and into a mystery that interweaves family dynamics, loss, and reconciliation. So two books I definitely say please check out. Dr. Copeland, thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure. I really appreciate this. And I am so glad to be in the company of these two excellent scholars of yokai and myth and monsters. So I look forward to this.
Great. Thank you very much. Next up is Michael Dillon Foster. He is a professor in the East Asian Languages and Culture Department at the University of California, Davis. His research focuses on Japanese folklore, literature and film, and monsters and supernatural studies, legend, folklore, popular culture, ritual and festival, tourism, and Asian folklore. He is the author of Pandemonium and Parade, Japanese Monsters and the Culture of Yokai, the Book of Yokai, Mysterious Creatures of Japanese Folklore, and the co-editor and author of The Folklorist, Reframing Folklore in a Popular Culture World. His expanded second edition of the Book of Yokai will be appearing late summer or early fall of this year. So if you've read the first one and you want to know more, you are in for a treat. Thank you.
And more pictures.
Oh, great. More
Many
pictures.
more pictures.
I was saying earlier, I was noticing the pictures back behind on the cork board and saying, I think I recognize those pictures.
Yeah, actually, that's one of the ones in the book.
So our third panelist who has just joined us, he's an award-winning, Zack Davisson is an award-winning translator, writer, and scholar of Japanese, about Japanese folklore and ghosts. He's the author of Yurei, the Japanese Ghost, The Ghost of Oyuki, the secret biwa music that caused the Yurei to lament from Chin Music Press. He was nominated for the 2014 Japanese-U.S. Friendship Commission Translation Prize and is the translator of the Eisner Award-winning and Harvey-nominated Shigeru Mizuki's Showa 1926 to 1939 to 1980.
It goes all the way to 1983. Yeah,
89.
1989.
I think it's a little longer than that. 1920 to 1989, A History of Japan. For Drawn and Quarterly, Davisson translates and curates the famous folklore also, he translated the famous folklore comic by Shigeru Mizuki, Gegege no Kitaro. His upcoming book, The Ultimate Guide to Japanese Yokai, will be out soon. Do we have a date, Zach?
It's in June,
All
I
right.
think. I don't know the exact date. And because this is a Zoom meeting, here is my cat.
Oh,
I also
thank
like to,
you.
introduce those.
I have many cats, and I'm wondering when they may or may not make an appearance.
Yeah.
All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Dr. Gorske. Yeah, I don't the technological difficulties, but that's okay.
You know, every time we do one of these and there's technical difficulties, I love it because it always reminds me of what Komatsu wrote in one of his books, and he's like, that's sort of the yokai saying hello. You know, they've got to come in, they've got to disturb a little bit of something, and now we know that their presence is with us.
Did he mention whether this is like a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, that's a whole different discussion.
Okay. All right. So let's get started. How did you come to this to Japan? How did that lead you to where you are today? Maybe we can go in alphabetical order again, and maybe Rebecca, if you want to start.
Sure. So actually, I was born in Japan. My parents were missionaries there. But as soon as my mother was able to travel after my birth, they moved to North Carolina, and that's where I grew up. And I had really no connection to Japan other than the stories that they and my older sisters would tell until I was a junior in college. And my parents decided to return to their previous appointment and encouraged me to go with them. And I have to tell you, I didn't want to go. I was a junior in college and I wanted to stay with my friends. You know, I didn't want to have to go live with my parents, but I I was convinced, and so I went to Japan and spent a year in Fukuoka, and it changed everything. I mean, you're so impressionable at that point, you know, and everything I encountered was just amazing. And when I returned to the United States, I knew I wanted to continue studying Japan. And it had to wait until I went to graduate school. And I was just there at graduate school to just indulge my curiosity. But one year led to another. And after a while, it's sort of like I'm invested. So I just went on for the PhD and ended up teaching Japanese literature.
Was Japanese a language that was always present in your house, or did you sort of know it when you were a kid and then have to relearn it when you went back?
Unfortunately, I didn't have any access to Japanese language when I was growing up. Occasionally, my parents and my sisters would say a word, but occasionally Japanese friends would stop by and visit. But other than that, there was no Japanese language. So I had to start at the age of 20. And I'm so jealous of most of my students are able to begin, many of them in high school, you know, and I think it's made a difference in sort of the number of translators that we have now.
Indeed, I think you're right about that. But I also think that probably some of the people who are here today might be in sort of the same shoes you are in terms of when they started learning Japanese. It's always nice to hear that someone who is very accomplished had to tackle something that maybe some students, as you say, have a better chance early on.
Yeah.
So you have written this book, Yamamba is a Japanese mountain witch. And what got you interested in mountain witches?
Well, because I work on women writers, many of the women writers would take the motif of the mountain witch or the image of the mountain witch and transform it in their modern stories. And so that got me really interested in, you know, what is it about the mountain witch that's so beguiling for these writers? And actually, this book is co-edited with Linda Ehrlich, and it was interesting that we don't know each other. We never met each other, but we both on Facebook found out that we had an interest in Yamamba, and we just said, hey, let's put a book together. And it sort of fell together like that. So I think the Yamamba was working behind the scenes.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I look forward to talking more about this later on in
Yes.
conversation, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Zach, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Well, Rebecca, I'm jealous that you started learning Japanese at 20 because I started learning at 30. So I guess, like my Japan origin story, I was growing up in the 80s. There actually wasn't that much Japanese content, especially compared to now. But I did have a mother who loved art films. And for some reason, she took me to see Seven Samurai when I was 8 years old. And I was just absolutely fascinated because it had been my first real, I guess, immersion of hearing a foreign language spoken. And I was so fascinated. Like I wanted to know what it sounded like in their heads. Like, did they think, did all that goobity goobity somehow make sense to them? And it just hooked me. And from then on, most of my life, like I tried studying Japanese in school. This was back in the early 80s. We actually didn't have enough people apply for the class, so it got canceled. So it was just like my whole life was attempting. And like then when I was about 33 years old and I was a project manager at Amazon, and like I had a straight path and I had a good career and I had good career prospects, like all the things that life tells you means you're doing well. And I was just unhappy. I was just like, I wasn't enjoying anything about my life. And I found the JET program randomly. And I was like, well, I've always been interested in Japan. I am going to do that. So I basically applied for the JET program, threw away all of that stuff to randomly hop onto a plane to a country I'd never been to before. And I was like, well, I'll go there for 1 year. And of course, 8 years later, I come home. But yeah, when I was in Japan, I just like, once I was there, and like that was also something where I'd always been sort of I'd always been interested in the supernatural. I've always been interested in folklore. And when I hit Japan, it was just like the absolute mother lode. Like there was just so much of it and it was incredible. And also, I would just ask a lot of my, Japanese friends I was there, like these questions, and they did not know the answer to them. Like I would be like, why do they do this? Like, I don't know. This is just how we do things. This is just how we do things. And I really wanted to know. So I started trying to find out, trying to dig down deeper and deeper into those answers. I ended up getting my master's degree in Hiroshima, and I wrote my master's thesis on Yude, on Japanese ghosts. And then what does one do with a master's thesis? I don't know. I turned mine into a book, and that was basically the start of my whole career. Oh, and I started a website too. I started a website because I was trying to sell my first book, and I'll never forget this because it was an editor at Kodansha, and I sent him my book, and he's like, I like your book, but the problem is I don't know who you are, and that means I can't sell your book. So he's like, go out and be somebody, and then once you are somebody, then I can actually sell you as a product. And I'm like, okay. So I started my blog, and yeah, that has been pretty much the road all the way up till here.
Another great sort of and interesting way in which you found your way, and in terms of like having to learn the language later, but also I think it's like a very good piece of advice, or a good like sort of real life experience for people who are interested in publishing, and that it's not just writing that thing sometimes it's also making sure that the publisher knows who you are.
Well, and also just like there was an idea of trying to find an open channel because, Michael Dylan Foster, he was doing the academic stuff, and Matt Alt, he was doing the real pop culture stuff. And it seemed like there was a middle ground there. There was a middle ground for stuff that wasn't light pop culture, and wasn't really heavy academia. And I called it my Carl Sagan lane. He was actually my model. I was like, there's got to be room for a populist, right? Someone who's an enthusiast, someone whose academic knowledge is good, but doesn't necessarily go all the way to pop culture, but just, and so that was kind of the lane that I saw for myself that I went into.
Well, you've got a couple of books, not just the book.
I do have many books out now. Yeah,
yeah.
many books, many translations. Yes.
So I think you're doing. It seems to me you're doing good.
I'm doing all right. Yeah.
The publishers know who you are now.
Yes. Now the publishers know. Now the publishers come to me, which is, I guess the position you want to be in. So
I should ask them if they have a good website.
Right? Yeah, that was my most recent book I did with Tuttle. They actually commissioned me to do a book for them, and that's the one that I have coming out next, The Ultimate Guide to Japanese Yokai. So
all right, and then last but certainly not least, Michael Dylan Foster, please take it away.
So I have the honor of having started learning Japanese right between the two of you, actually, age-wise. I think I was probably, I think 22 or 23. And for me, I didn't study anything related to Japan in college, except one course on Buddhism, actually. But I wanted to bum around the world and make a living wherever I could, and be a novelist. So I traveled a lot and worked. I have the distinction of having been a dishwasher on 4 continents, because that was about the only job I could get. But the most interesting is a long kind of circuitous story, and I'll make it really quick. But I got a job. I lived off the on a small island off the coast of the west coast of Scotland, working on a scallop farm for about 3 months. And all the technology was from Japan. All the scallop farming technology was from Japan. So after I had to leave the UK and return to the US for visa purposes, I was looking for another way to go to another country. And I realized, wouldn't it be cool to go to Japan? Because it's an interesting place. And all the scallop farming, I was obsessed with scallop farming and aquaculture. And I thought all the technology comes from there. I'll go to Japan. And I applied for the JET program. And I was actually sent to Fukuoka, so actually Kitakyushu City. So I was way down in the south, and the first Japanese I learned was hotate gai no yōshoku, scallop, scallop farming. And I used to ask a lot of people where they got the scallops, and I discovered they were all from a lot of the yōshoku, the scallop farming was up in the north in Aomori Prefecture, and actually further up north in Hokkaido. I was also really interested in Dazai Osamu, a Japanese author who was from Aomori. So I lived in Kyushu for about 3.5 years, and then before returning to the US to start graduate school studying something relating to Japan, I traveled up north on my way to Aomori to check out the scallop farming and Dazai Osamu's house. But I got caught in the rain and ended up staying in the town of Hanamaki in Iwate-ken, which is, and I stayed at a very inexpensive minshuku kind of bed and breakfast. And the woman who ran it said to me, it sounds like you're interested in Japanese culture. You should go to the next town over. The next town over is the town of Tono, which is the place that is written about in Yanagita Kunio's Tono Monogatari, The Legends of Tono. I knew nothing about any of that, but I went there and I bought a copy of the book in the train station. I spent a few days traveling around Tono, went up to Aomori and started reading the book, met some scallop farmers. And then when I entered graduate school at UC Berkeley, I was studying literature, but I was really interested in this book, The Legends of Tono. And I asked my professor, can I write about this for the literature class? He said no, because it's not, strictly speaking, literature, and it was also a pre-modern literature class, and it's really a very modern book. So he directed me to folklore studies at UC Berkeley, which at that time Alan Dundas, who was a very famous American folklorist, was working there, and that's how I discovered that I was interested in folklore. And while I was taking that course, I had to write a master's thesis while I was doing my taking a lot of folklore courses. And I didn't know what to focus on. I knew I would be in it for a long time. And I had a little kappa statue that somebody had given to me in Kyushu. I don't even remember where I got it, but I suddenly one day picked it up and just looked at it and thought, what is this thing? And that's how I started studying kappa and wrote my master's thesis on kappa, and then eventually a lot more on yokai when I did my PhD. So that's how I got into it.
Amazing.
I still like scallops too, but
Well, that's good. I'm glad you were able to continue that love. So Michael, you were a jet in Fukuoka. Zach, where were you a jet?
I was in Nara for 3 years and then Osaka. So I did 2 prefectures.
Oh, interesting. And I take it, Rebecca, you did not go walk the path of the jet program.
I did not. I don't even know if JET was around when I was going through things. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for those introductions. And it's really amazing, sort of the ways that each of you sort of came to Japan and to the monsters that perhaps have defined a lot of the things you do. do you believe, and I'm going to use the word supernatural. I'm not going to use the word ghosts or monster. I'm just going to say supernatural. Are you a supernatural believer, or are you not a believer?
See, you've already thrown out the answer right there, because Hanchi Hangyo is what I give to almost everyone, you know.
Oh,
I mean, I personally consider myself, I consider myself agnostic on the subject of the supernatural, you know. I feel like, I don't know. I feel like there's room in the world for the mysterious, you know. There's room in the world for the unknown, and I think it's a bit arrogant to say that we know absolutely everything there is to ever possibly be known on Earth, and that it can all be explained and all of that stuff. And I also think that it's kind of fun, you know, like I live in the Pacific Northwest, and if you ask me right now, I would say Bigfoot absolutely 100% exists. If you ask me to place a bet on that money wise, I will place no bets. But it's just fun, you know. I enjoy it, and I enjoy believing in the supernatural. And if you leave me alone in a cemetery, I will believe in ghosts 2 seconds later. You know, I mean, so yeah, I believe in it to the extent that it adds joy to my life, but not to the extent to where I don't know, not the extent that it controls me, if that makes sense.
all right. So you're more like an Edo era enthusiast, as opposed to like a Heian era courtier worrying about like the monster
Yeah, you
kingdoms.
know, absolutely. Like, and I've been on a couple of podcasts. I wrote a book on ghosts. Like, I love ghosts. I think ghosts are absolutely fascinating. But I have no interest in proving the existence of ghosts. I don't think that proving the existence of them would add anything to the topic of ghosts. You know, I think that that's just. I'm not going to run around houses with a little e-meter and a camera trying to capture spooky voices. Like, that's not my interest.
Rebecca?
I have no reason not to believe in the supernatural, but I have no proof. I have had no encounters with supernatural. What I do believe in is mystery and wonder and surprise, and I like not knowing about things. I like discovery, but I also like being left in the dark too. And the fact that darkness allows so many other possibilities, right? So I don't like things to be explained.
Yeah,
And
and I would agree with both Zach and Rebecca on everything they've said. And I would also add, I think it's really interesting that we, in the Japan context, at least since the Meiji period, people like Inoue Enryo have been doing serious studies trying to either debunk or prove the existence of yōkai or ghosts or the supernatural, whatever we want to call it. But it's really interesting that we still think of it as a binary, when it clearly, for a lot of us, I think, is not a binary. And even with a fictional character, fictional characters we know are fictional. The characters in Rebecca's book are, I assume, made up. Nevertheless, when I read it, I felt moved by their action. The fact that a fictional character can make us cry or laugh or scream or whatever means, I think we have I've called it, I think I like to call it cognitive resonance. So we can believe and not believe at the same time, and that's actually a very productive way to exist in the world, oddly enough.
Yeah, I agree. I also I was reminded of actually a Komatsu quote that I used as the start of my most recent book, because I thought it was so beautiful. He says, I hope that playing with the mysterious brings us great pleasure." And I'm like, that is exactly it right there.
I think this is a very interesting sort of direction that we've taken, mainly because we're talking about things that are sometimes scary and sometimes, and certainly anything that we would put in the land of horror is scary. But at the same time, I feel like all three of you are speaking to sort of a pleasure and a reveling in the mysterious.
So that's the thing, though. Being afraid is fun. I mean, that's
Right.
why we watch horror movies, right? So it doesn't have to be like, there's a certain deliciousness of being afraid, of that sensation, the hair on the back of your neck. And I guess that's a little different from true terror. You know, there's degrees where it's fun to be afraid, and then all of a sudden it's not. But there's a reason why people go to haunted houses. There's a people why, like, I have done this multiple times, sought out mystery spots in haunted places when I was in Japan, for that feeling, that little tingly fear that you like. It's fun.
We've talked briefly about some questions beforehand, so I wanted to jump right into it. And I'm going to ask this question to Michael first, but of course, Rebecca and Zach, if you want to add, I think you probably have something to say about this, which is, in terms of the folk and folklore, what is the draw of this, do you think, in your experiences and talking with people and in your study of people who have studied it? Why in Japan are they interested in this? And why do you think Japanese folklore in particular has become such an interest outside of Japan?
So, well, in terms of, I mean, it's depends how you want to approach it. I think in terms of the study of folklore, that's a whole sort of, Japan has its own history of that, which is which we don't have time to talk about too much here. But I think in terms of, thoughts and stories and narratives and yokai in small communities, and one aspect of that is simply the communal aspect of, I mean, there's still a lot of rural communities in Japan where people for generations have related stories, often related to the landscape. So there's, that story is, that legend is associated with that river or whatever. So that there's a kind of self-propulsion that goes on there when people tell the stories to their kids, and then it also becomes written about, part of popular culture, part of literature, part of advertising, right, in the community. So that's one level, I think, of the popularity in a small level. But the other thing I think in Japan in particular, of course, and Zach can probably speak to this even more, is just the sort of incredible power of popular culture and manga and anime, which is, of course, building on an entire kind of infrastructure of popular culture that's existed since the Edo period. So that in the case of yokai, they've never really disappeared, even if whatever we want to call sort of pure belief, or an oral aspect of folklore may have disappeared in a small community. That doesn't mean that particular yokai has ceased to exist. It's been reconfigured, reinvented as a character in Kibyoshi or Edo period texts, or in Toriyama Sekien's encyclopedias, or whatever configuration. So they've never left the purview of people's imagination, in a sense. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that, but that seems to me one reason they're so much still of a kind of vital part of people's imaginations in Japan. And maybe that's one reason they also are attractive to people from other cultures as well. That there's the translation, and again, Zach can talk to that specifically, probably with the translation of Mizuki Shigeru, and how there's a ready audience for that, because people are aware of those popular culture incarnations of yokai and aspects of the supernatural and that sort of thing. I don't know if that was a very coherent answer, but but I think it's a complicated question, but and it really is based on different forms of media, and also different regions of the country as well.
Yeah, I definitely I mean, I lived in Yamaguchi City, and right next to it, in Yuta Onsen, when you get off the train, there's a giant white fox, and there's a whole story about that fox and how it founded the town.
Right. So it never actually leaves. It's always there in some form. It means something different to different people, but the sort of presence of that folklore, that narrative, that history is celebrated in a way that wouldn't have occurred if they hadn't built that statue and they hadn't used it perhaps for village revitalization or tourism or whatever purpose that was, but it becomes part of that, I think.
Well, thank you. So you had sort of been suggesting Zach might have some things.
Yeah, I was gonna say, do we raise our hand, or how do we pass the baton there? I think obviously everything Michael said I agree with. One thing I would add on to that is that one thing Japan has always been enormously great at is character design. And that is one of the main things that has helped perpetuate worldwide the yokai. I mean, even going back to the Muromachi picture scrolls and moving all the way up through the Edo period, and how, those eventually, they were just essentially ready-made for pop cultures. You have these great characters, and they have provided to be just like meat for artists of across the world. You just show an artist a yokai, and 10 minutes later, they're drawing a yokai. It's just, that's part of the appeal. And there's so much of it. There's so much variety. It is, obviously like Pokemon, because Pokemon obviously essentially comes from yokai, but they're just delightfully designed. They're so much fun to draw the umbrella ghost, to draw the kappa. All of that helps perpetuate their popularity.
Maybe we can discuss that, Rebecca. So in your book, Yamamba, this In Search of the Mountain Witch, you're the author, and as you mentioned, you're the co-editor of. This is a very unique Japanese monster. Though based on what I have read and based on sort of all the things that you've sort of alluded to today, I think calling the mountain witch may not be the right word to describe a mountain witch.
That's true. When Linda and I were putting the book together, she didn't like the translation mountain witch. She didn't like the translation witch because she thought it tied the Japanese character too closely to Western concepts of witch. But I'm not exactly sure I share particularly her concern in that regard. I think you know, the Yamamba, she lures, or she if an unfortunate man crosses her mountain fastness, she dispatches with him, right? She eats him, and that's kind of monstrous when you think about it, right? She's a cannibal. But I think the level of monsterness really depends on who's telling the story and for what purpose. I feel that the mountain witch, the Yamamba, is a container for fear, for masculine fear, the fear of the female power. And one way that you contain power is to denigrate it, right? And to ostracize it, to contain it in a story. And so from that point of view, from the point of view of the originators of the mountain witch, she is a monster. From the point of view of others who tell her story, such as the women writers that I referred to, they tell the story closer to the mountain witch's perspective herself, right? They tend to tell the story from the inside out, identifying with the mountain witch. So, you know, why would anybody want to identify with a witch or with a monster, with a hideous person? And I think there is something about the mountain witch that suggests the ostracizing of creativity, or the ostracizing of individuality. And so many creative women find in their own practice a fear of being sort of jettisoned from society, because if you're a creative person, you're not like everybody else typically. So there are stories of Japanese women writers saying, like, I worked, you know, I was writing, I didn't care about my hair, I forgot to make supper for my husband, you know, I'm a bad wife, therefore I am kind of like a mountain witch. He thinks of me as a witch now. I might be thrown out into the mountains. I mean, that's a exaggeration, but there's a sense that the creative woman is someone who has to be contained. And one way of doing that is by creating these cautionary tales of monsters.
You know, one of the things that my horror class talked about recently is we read from along with your story, which I want to get to in a bit, but we also read Oba Minako's Smile of a Mountain Witch.
Yes.
And we had quite an interesting discussion on whether or not that's a horror story. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about it, or maybe if any of you have thoughts about that particular story.
Yeah, so in the story, the narrator understands that she is a mountain witch, and she recognized her power early on as a young girl, but she also learned that she had to cater to other people, and in a way give up her power, or not exploit her powers, other than to cater to other people. So in the end, we kind of get the impression that not only was she a mountain witch, so was her mother, and most likely also her daughter. So in other words, don't all women have within them the potential to be mountain witches? And yet they all deny that power, they deny that potential, so that they can conform to what the society wants. And that's the real sadness in the story, is that she and her mother, she and her daughter are never allowed to communicate with one another. They can never share their power. The lineage that they pass from one to another is the story of self-denial, of submission. And that's a tragedy. So I find it more of a tragic tale than a horror tale.
I don't know the answer to this, but I wonder if most horror, when really unpacked, is not really also just a very sad, tragic
Yeah.
narrative, right? And I don't know what I don't know then what makes horror, but that's I guess another question.
Well, I mean, now I'm thinking about your book, Zach, Yure, and the different sort of women, the female ghosts that you talk about, and how they are often figures of horror, but it seems like in their lives are not great.
No, their lives are tragic, and I mean, I think that's one of the things. Like if you look at it from a horror point of view, I think there's nothing more terrifying in Japanese folklore than an onyo, right? The ghost of vengeance. You know, that is the great fear. You know, you can redeem the Yamuba, you can write it from their point of perspective, but an onyo is just scary. You know, and I think that, like, you know, and the whole topic of the scary women, it's always something I feel a little unqualified to talk about because it's not really my realm, you know, per se. But I can certainly look, like, one of the interesting transitions was, if you look at more Heian period ghost stories, there were usually some really elite man, you know, that was really like, you know, your academics, your scholars. And then in the Edo period, when the horror stories went out of the sort of aristocrat's home into the home of the common people, that's sort of the birth of this figure that we know nowadays a lot of in Japanese horror, which is this, you know, this woman of terror that, you know, she has had something very tragic to her, and she wreaks her vengeance. I personally think that part of that is because in the particular era, and perhaps now as well, men were expected to have their own personal power to sort of avenge themselves. You know, if you were a samurai or something, you had strength, you had power to enact things in your own life, whereas women simply were victims, you know, circumstances were thrust upon them. And so the idea that this victim could then suddenly transform into the aggressor maybe possibly had something about that. That's one of the things I think about. I also think that they just looked cool. You know, like a lot of the stuff with the modern onyo comes from kabuki theater with Oiwa and her massive amounts of hair, and the special effects that were built that where you had, you know, the stagehands underneath shoving hair onto stage to create this just sort of like unnatural sense of terror. You know, I mean, once again, that kind of gets back to character design, because you also had male ghosts in the Edo period, but they didn't last as well because the artists just didn't create as stunning images of the male ghosts as they did. Like Kohara Keide is a pretty popular one. You know, you see Hokusai's picture of him leaning over the, you know, with his skeletal face, but that's pretty much a one-off. It didn't really continue on. So yeah, I don't know. I'd be interested to hear more about, like, maybe Rebecca or Michael has to say about that, because that's a little bit out of my realm, other than what I know from history.
So if I can introduce one thing, a more recent female monster, as it were, the Kuchisake Onna, the slit-mouthed woman, who's a very sort of a quintessential modern yokai that started in 1979. Probably, I assume I just actually asked my own class of students here at UC Davis how many of them had heard of her, and I was shocked how many had heard of her. So I guess she's recirculating in various places. There's a recent manga about her as well. But
yeah, my wife, as an elementary school child in Japan, was terrified of the Kuchisake Onna, and she said they used to be walked to and from school in groups to help, just in case they might be attacked.
Fantastic. Well, and that, so the Kuchisake Onna, for people who don't know, was a yokai that appeared, and I can date your wife's age now, Zach, from what you just said.
I know.
Appeared in actually December 1978, and for about 6 months into 1979 was explosively popular throughout Japan, appearing in, I think, pretty much every prefecture. It was basically what we would now call an urban legend or a contemporary legend. But the story was that a child walking home from school would be approached by a woman in her 20s and 30s, you know, well dressed, you know, normal looking person, except she had a mask on, like the kind of mask we all are aware of using now. But in those days in Japan, that was also relatively normal for somebody with a cold. And then she would tap them on the shoulder or approach them and say, "Watashi kirei, am I pretty?" And then pull down her mask and reveal that her mouth was slit from ear to ear, and say, "Kore demo," even like this, "Am I pretty?" And then the story actually accrued all sorts of different elements to it and got more and more sophisticated. But one aspect of that, to my mind, sort of plays into what Rebecca and Zack were both talking about, the notion of power within a patriarchal society, right? Where the very question of this slit-mouthed woman, am I pretty, could be interpreted as conforming to the demands of the patriarchal society at the moment. A woman has to be pretty. And then when she reveals that she's actually quite, she can be aggressive, she can be dangerous, and maybe not so pretty, what does that do to the society? So of course it was a story that kids were scared of, but I think it also had a really important, could be interpreted as having a really important statement about the role of women, and in this case, probably a young mother that was about the right age for her in that particular moment in Japanese history. And it was the time when the women's liberation movement, for example, was really getting off the ground in Japan, and women were participating in protests in favor of the pill and other things. And sometimes they actually wore masks in those protests. So it can be sort of tied up with all of that. And so it's a sort of concrete modern example of the kind of Yamamba or even Yude power of a woman being exerted against the sort of hegemony of male domination in the society.
Yeah, it's so interesting that so many of these stories deal with duplicity, right? This notion of the woman not really being who she is, and so you have this constant fear of transformation, right? And again, I think mythologically that goes back to the power of the biological power of the female body to transform, to double, to duplicate, from the ancient point of view in a way that's absolutely inexplicable and terrifying. So way back in the Kojiki myths, you have women who say, "Don't look at me, I'm in labor," when I'm in labor, and she turns into a wani or a crocodile or whatever. I don't know that they have crocodiles in Japan, but she would turn into this horrible creature in childbirth. So there's this fear of the gentle, docile, fragile woman who conceals this incredible power, has its out in these myths. And I liked what Zack pointed out with the Yude or the Onryo, who in life have no power, and so the suppression has to out itself in these horrific revenge stories. Then, so in a way that speaks to the consciousness of the people who are suppressing them, that their fear is coming back on them in these horror stories.
And I also really like what Michael, you also said about the Kuchisake Onna as well. Is like, I love the fact that Japan keeps generating new yokai, that it's not all in the past, because it reminded me instantly of Toire no Hanako-san, Hanako-san of the toilet, in that because you're talking about these stories being spread by kids, which is exactly, of course, how Hanako of the toilet appeared as well. Kids like to be scared, they like to tell stories, and and these stories will spread. And I think that's the lore of the folk. A story told once is just a story, but a story told twice, a story told 3 times, that's how folklore starts, and the pantheon of yokai keeps continuing forward and forward and forward as new ones are created.
I'm reminded of a lot of the students of my students are reading Toilet Bound Hanako-kun.
Oh yeah, when they gender flipped Hanako, yeah.
Which I just first, based on everything that everyone's been talking about, I don't know if he has quite the same bite, but he has a whole other MO.
This is one of my things. Especially talking on terror, I think that this is one of the most interesting thing about monsters, right? Is societies always do this, and maybe there's a deeper reason behind it, but the only thing I can ever come up with is the Harry Potter spell Ludicrous that they would cast, where something's really scary, and so you cast a spell and you turn it into something funny. And society has always seemed to do that with its monsters, right? We take something that really scares us, and so we make it sexy, or we make it funny, or somehow we make it so it's not frightening anymore. Like, try and frighten someone with a vampire nowadays. You're not going to do it. They have lost all power to be frightening. But as that happens, as we sort of defang our vampires, we need monsters to frighten us. And so we create new monsters, new ones to come. And maybe Hanako has had her time, and maybe Hanako is now transformed. Someone has cast Ludicrous on Hanako, and I bet there's a new monster being generated even now that I don't know about, or none of us know about, because it's just a whisper by kids in elementary school, and it hasn't bubbled up to the surface yet to where the boring academics can get their grips into it. And it's still being alive and being fed. The monster's being fed and created right now. I bet you anything that that's happening.
I mean, Kuchisake Onna is a great example. She, depending on where you are, how to deal with her completely changes. And her clothes changes, her what she's carrying changes. Are there yokai? Maybe we could talk a little bit about yokai that you have come across where you've seen that you really can't quite get a beat on them because they're so different in so many different places.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like Kappa is one of the main ones for me. Kappa are so easy to describe on a surface level, and then you get anything beyond the surface level to where they're transforming into different kappa during summer and autumn, and in this land it becomes a monkey, and over here it becomes this. I mean, like, that was the worst entry for me to write on my yokai encyclopedia, because I knew that what deserved a book, and I was trying to write it in one little page there. There's just so much there. It's overwhelming.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I mean, Kappa, I think, is a great example, and one of the reasons I personally have been very reluctant in my book of yokai. I have kind of encyclopedic sections, but it was a real challenge to write those because there's a tendency, I think, when people talk about yokai or any folklore for that matter, but particularly things like yokai, to speak in a kind of eternal present tense, and to genericize. So, the kappa does such and such, but the kappa is a great example of something that there's a book, there's a kappa jiten, a kappa dictionary in Japan. I can't remember the editor, but I believe it's about 500 pages long, and it lists every name for kappa that has been recorded, and there are literally thousands of them. And the kappa has existed. But if we say that, then what is the kappa? What is it we're talking about? So in my own experience, for example, I've done a lot of research on a very small island off the coast of Kagoshima called Shimokoshikijima. Research on a totally different topic. But when I was there, I asked a lot of people about yokai, and one of the yokai on the island is a kappa. But it was called, so the older people that I met told me about something called a gamishiro. And I said, what is a gamishiro? And they explained it to me, but they invariably said it's like a kappa. And then they described it, and some parts were similar to kappa, the sort of generic version of kappa, some were different. But then if you trace the history of kappa, the word kappa itself is really from the Kanto region. In the West, in the Kansai region, a more common word is kawataro, and the description of those are actually quite different. So there was a moment in the Edo period, I think a lot because of popular culture and print media, that they sort of came together, and kappa became the sort of generic.
Would you say the Suitora also, the water tiger? That seems to be another one that was in that mix.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there Suiko and Kawataro,
yeah.
Garappa, Enko, and all regional things, but somehow they came together under this rubric of the kappa, and that's fine, I guess, for a classification, but it also genericizes them a bit. I think they lose their distinctions, and whether that's good or bad, I'm not making a judgment, just sort of observing the way that happens. And I think that happens with a lot of yokai, actually. The kappa is one that's fantastic in its great variety. That even now, if you go to certain communities, you can say, do you have a kappa legend? And they'll say, well, we don't call it a kappa, but so-and-so. But they know exactly what you're talking about because it's associated with the kappa. So it's anyway, there's a kind of, there's a difficulty in writing about folklore and folklore creatures and in hammering down what it is you're actually talking about.
That's why, actually, Michael, and Rebecca also 'cause we kind of did the same thing. I think that there were almost like enough. You laid the groundwork with enough general books on yokai that we could pick just one creature and do
Mm.
something very specific. Because I've written a book on yurei, and I've written a book on kaibyo, on magical cats, and I think that like the study of Japanese folklore has progressed far enough. We don't really need general books anymore. We're good, and now we can write the 500-page kappa book. Like when Rebecca, when I saw you were doing your book on Yoma, I'm like, yes, because that's one I didn't know very much about, and I was just so excited. I was like, I want more of that, more of those really specific books that can dive a little bit more into instead of having to genericize things so badly.
Yeah, and well, that one was also how Yamamba has inspired
Mhm.
people beyond Japan, right?
Hmm.
And so I think it would be fun to have a kappa book or a book of stories about kappa or another
Hmm.
yokai, more international, right? Because
Hmm.
they're slipping beyond borders now.
Hmm.
Yeah, a lot. That's one of the things I've talked about a lot. It's like the yokai have almost, because of their spread through anime and manga, and there was even an America TV show called Kappa Mikey back in the 90s. Like they're almost like world folklore. Like when does something become, like when does a vampire stop being world, like European folklore, and simply become world folklore? Like where is that
Mhm.
tipping point? And have any of the yokai made that tipping point yet? That's something else I don't really know the answer to, but it's an interesting question.
So I'm going to start with some questions that were given to us in advance. They wanted to know, is there some sort of pattern that exists in that you've discovered in looking at all of these yokai, that they don't exist as a good or evil creature, but as a sort of amorphous creature? And is there a reason for that?
I mean, there's the Shinto reason of the double souls that could dig into, the Raimetama and the Mitama, which is the idea that all things have either a rough face or a gentle face. And so that's a deep part of Japanese religion as well, Japanese society, that it's not as diametrically good and evil opposed. I think that's almost more of a Western thing, that you must be good or you must be evil. And their religion accounts for both. But also, I think that with yokai, like the more they approach personhood, the more they have the ability to be both. Like some yokai are not, they're pretty generic. There's like, if you look at something like, oh, I'm trying to think of some, all I can really pop up in my head is Shirime, and he's just like, eyeball butt. Like there's not a lot of story there. There's not a lot going on. But then you get up into something like that has been created more personhood, like a Tengu, or even like, Kappa, where they have books being written of people going to Kappa world. And the more that they approach personhood, the more they have the ability to be both, because humans have the ability to be both. But there are also some generic yokai. I mean, that's certainly not true of all yokai. There's lots and lots and lots of yokai out there that are just what they are and nothing more. I mean, Mizuki Shigeru wrote that about once, that in one of his books, where he was talking about the Hazuki Arai. He's like, why do you, Hazuki Arai? He's like, why do you do this? He's like, because this is what I am. I am not. I don't have two souls like human beings. I'm single souled, and this is what I do. All I do is wash the beans, or count the beans. That is all I can do forever, because that is who I am. Or Azuki Hakari, that's who it was. Yeah.
If I can just add to, I think it's
Hmm.
interesting. I mean, a lot of yokai, as Zach sort of indicated about Azuki Hakari, don't do anything but what they do,
Hmm.
and it's the human reaction to them that causes the fear. If you hear somebody counting beans or washing beans,
Hmm.
and that's all they're doing, you can think that's wonderful, or you can think that's really frightening, right? So there's but that yokai itself is its own agency is determined simply
Hmm.
by the human observation of it. And I think maybe Yamamba is that way as well, right? I mean, there's so many literature, of course, but also in local folklore about Yamamba. They're completely neither good nor
Exactly.
evil. It just depends on who's dealing with it.
Right. I mean, this Benneristic thinking, I think, as Zach suggested, is probably pretty Western. So the Yamamba too is positive. She's a positive force as well as a malevolent force, but isn't that nature
Hmm.
as well?
Yeah.
So
Like the fire that warms you can also burn you, is kind of like the thought of how it works. They can be everything at the same time. Yeah.
Over the summer, I had a chance to do some research in Shikoku, in the mountains of Shikoku, and I met some really interesting people in a very small community that's on a very steep mountain side. And one guy there was just brilliant in his analysis of yokai. because he talked about all these yokai that when he was growing up, he was warned about certain yokai. And to him, as a child, they were incredibly frightening. But his analysis was for his parents, and actually he was brought up by his grandparents. For his grandparents, those yokai were helpers, because they were, by invoking those yokai, his grandparents were saving him from real dangers of falling off cliffs and getting stuck in the forest. And then another thing he said was that people often ask him, what's the distinction between kami and yokai, between deity figures and yokai? And he made this great statement. He said, academics always want to know that. These are academics who have never lived in this village. But in this village, kami can shapeshift and do terrible things, just like yokai can shapeshift and do wonderful things. And it was this really nice argument that the kind of distinctions that we often look for are really simply academic distinctions, and that in the lived experience, these distinctions are really not important. That's kind of interesting.
Oh my gosh, Michael, I agree with that so much, because like that's something that I actually wrote that about my new book, because like academics, they love to classify. Like that is our like what is and is not a yokai is such an important question, So we just have to noodle down on that and figure out. But ultimately, it doesn't matter, Ultimately, like to the folklore itself, it's all yokai all the way down, or it doesn't. Like, what is this? I don't know. It's a yokai. Like the eternal question of, is Godzilla yokai? I mean, sure, why not? That's kind of my answer, but I know other people disagree.
I feel like Michael, you specifically, you say that you don't think Godzilla's a yokai.
Well, but having said that, the word yokai has actually evolved a great deal since that. I wrote that in my book, that I didn't think Godzilla was a yokai, and that was reflecting how he's treated in Japan. I think the average Japanese person, not necessarily a scholar, but the average Japanese person would say Godzilla is a kaiju. It's not a yokai, right? And there's a distinction being made there. Whether that distinction is important or not, is another question.
Yeah.
But I think, and the one thing I would say, Zach, that academics do like to classify, but a lot of people like to classify.
Oh, they love it.
Right?
Oh, yeah, not just academics. Like everyone that's ever bought a Pokemon Pokedex wants to classify things. Like we love, as human beings, we love to classify. Oh, yes.
So I think that question comes. So people will make a distinction between yokai and kaiju, and certainly Godzilla. So to my mind, one thing that distinguishes Godzilla, two things, is one, his immense size, but also the fact that we know his very commercial origins.
But we know the very commercial origins of many yokai that were created by Toriyama Seiken. The only difference there is a one of age. One has lasted for a couple hundred years, and one has not.
So Godzilla may become
yokai in the future. I was quite proud of, in my yokai encyclopedia, of putting in an entry for kaiju, specifically thinking of you, going like, you know what, maybe I will be the first book to include yokai, kaiju as a yokai, or maybe I'll be the last, but there it is.
There may be kaiju enthusiasts who disagree with that. Yeah.
Hey man, maybe I'll sell a few more books then. Maybe the controversy will do in my favor. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, that was I sort of threw the gauntlet down at you there, buddy. So
that's fine with me. But I do think, I mean, that is one thing about the word yokai, for example, as when I first started studying yokai, even in Japan, it wouldn't immediately, people wouldn't realize what I was talking about right away. It would take a moment. You'd have to say yokai and then bakemono, or use some other word to sort of enforce what you were talking about. Now it's completely different. Yokai has become a very commonly used term. And go back further in history, of course, it was different as well. So
I had to fight my first editor on Mizuki Shigeru's book so hard to keep the word yokai in English, because the common thing to do was to translate it either as demon or goblin or something like that. And I was like, no, trust me, 10 years from now, you'll be happy we kept it as yokai. So one of our goals, I've always wanted yokai to actually enter the English language dictionary. One of these days. It's not there yet, but I feel that we'll get there. And I think that is one of the things that keep yokai really vibrant and valid in the modern world, is they are obakemono, and changing things change. They don't stay the same. They modify, they transform, they meet the new demands of society. Like Rebecca, my first introduction with Yaumba was the fashion. Like I didn't even
Uh-huh.
realize that that was a folklore thing until I learned what that was, and then researched it a little bit later, you know. And that was such an odd adaptation of that mountain witch to become this ridiculous Tokyo fashion girl, you
Yeah,
know.
but she was channeling again. She
Hmm.
was channeling the uh ability of the Amamba to terrorize. She's terrorizing the public, right? And
Sure.
she is standing apart from the
Hmm.
crowd, just like the Yamamba is sort of being ostracized out into the mountains.
Hmm.
But she's owning it, you know, and so
Yeah.
there's a sense of power there.
And as a former 80s punk rocker, I understand that because I had the mohawk and the chains and leather. And part of that was the power of being able to generate fear in people simply by your presence. It was an amazing thing to do, just to be able to walk down the street and have people afraid of you for nothing more than the way you styled your hair and put on a jacket. You know, it was interesting.
Yeah.
All right, we're pretty much at the end here, but I was wondering if maybe there's one of the last questions, and if I didn't make it to a question that was asked, I'm sorry. I'll try and share and maybe share with our panelists and try and get those answers back to you.
Hmm.
But the question of is there any media that you find interesting now that sort of that's scratching your yokai itch right now?
I mean, I'm always gonna toss the coin for my guy Mizuki Shigeru. I mean, his stuff is just defining in the genre, and we're still putting out more and more of it to this day via Drawn and Quarterly. So, yeah, I mean that's really good. I mean, of the modern stuff, it could be really tough. I think for me, you know, like Demon Slayer is obviously a worldwide phenomenon that has created an incredible boost in yokai.
So with Yamamba, I mean, it's not limited to print or to words,
Hmm.
right? There's well, Yamamba sort of comes from performance in a way, from
Hmm.
the No theater gives the Yamamba the name, or perpetuates the name Yamamba. So you have dance, you have theater, you have photography.
Hmm.
It's multimedia.
Yeah, I don't have all that much to add, but just one small comment. I find it really curious. So Zach is translating Mizuki Shigeru, which
Hmm.
is immensely important, I think, because what I've found when I teach to students now, most of my students have never heard of Mizuki, but they know the more recent translations,
Hmm.
Nurari Hyo no Mago, and you know,
Yep.
and Demon Slayer, all these things, which to my mind, these are the mangaka and the anime artists are sort of the grandchildren of Mizuki.
Oh
So it's
yeah.
sort of interesting that it skipped a generation, and now I teach one of
Yeah.
Zach's translations to my
Hmm.
students in a popular culture course, and they're kind of freaked out that this existed before the stuff that they're already aware of. So I
And
think
that,
that's
yeah.
it's important. It's a great service to sort of
Hmm.
fill in that blank, which is really incredibly important
Well, and
for
that was something, I mean, discovering Mizuki was a big shock to me because I went to Japan for the first time and learned that like what the West likes about Japan and what Japan likes about Japan are not the same thing at all, you know? And going over there and see what a Japanese person would buy of Japanese culture versus what a Western person would, like Mizuki Shigeru is enormously popular in Japan, like Walt Disney level of famous. And over here, he's like very, you know, completely unknown, you know?
right.
So it is fascinating to see what bridges that gap and what doesn't bridge that gap. Interestingly, because of the topic, horror is so much easier to bridge than comedy. Like comedy requires on mostly cultural clues or linguistic clues. I mean, that's what we make fun of jokes, right? Jokes are language based or cultural based. They're very hard to translate. We don't all laugh at the same things, but we are all scared of the same things. And that is one of the reasons why horror is so much more easy to translate.
Thank you all for coming today. In the
Mhm.
audience, thank you to our panelists. Thank you for being uh, honest and excited about these things. I mean, clearly you're writing about them, and I think one of the things that I'm definitely going to take away from this is the idea that every single monster there could be a book written about that monster.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
and so,
easily.
I
Well,
mean,
maybe not cheating me, maybe not eyeball butt. You only really get a sentence for that, you know.
but the
Well,
idea
there's
that
75 participants right now, so if every one of them takes a single yokai,
Takes a single
we'll
yokai,
have a
yeah.
pretty good library in a few
And
years.
I think that's a good thing about future yokai studies is that, like, you know, there is still room. There is still room for specialists. You know, like I'll never be able to research them all. I'd love to read. If one of you guys there, 75 people writes the book on a certain yokai, I will be the first person to buy it. I guarantee, because I would love to read about it.